Spade back here with you, High Noon Leatherworks, for another leather adventure. And today we're going to continue on the black powder pistol shoulder holster project. And today we're doing some stitching on the actual holster. So come on in and let's get started. The first thing I want to do is pull out a couple of stitching needles because I'm going to do saddle stitching on this holster. So I'll need 2 needles. I've got some synthetic sinew in tan, and I'll need to clean that beginning end up there with my scissors. Want a nice clean end to start with. So I've got my synthetic sinew. I'm actually going to stitch this in my stitching horse. So I made me a couple of leather shims that I can place in that stitching horse on each side. And I'll show you that in a second. But what that does, that keeps me from squeezing down and scarring any of the holster leather. So the pressure's on the outside of these 2 shims. Because I like to not only clamp my stitching horse down, but I like to put an extra hand clamp on it, keep it real nice and tight while I'm stitching. I don't like it if it slides around. So the first thing I want to do is cut my synthetic sinew, and as a rule of thumb, when I'm saddle stitching, I always take the length of my stitch, which is going to be from right up here is where I'm going to start, and I'm going to end at the toe so I can hide that stitch, that last stitch, and I'll show you that here toward the end when I get down to the toe. But I always take a rule of thumb, the length of my stitch times 4. So if I take the length of my stitch with my sinew and double that, so that's 2 times, there's 3 times, and there's 4 times. So I go 4 times the length of my actual travel of my stitch, and then I always add about 4 inches or so just to make sure I have plenty of extra. The key is you don't ever want to be short. You're always better off having more left over so you can cut it off, but if you're short, then it poses a problem when you run out of thread or your sinew. So I'll clean those ends up, and then you think, wow, I got a long piece of string or sinew or thread that I'm going to have to go through there. Well, when I thread my needle, what I like to do is thread my first needle, thread my second one on the other end, and I want to make sure that I have the same amount pulled through the eye of that needle on each side. That way I don't run out of thread on one side or the other. And then what I'll do is I'll pull that down through the eye of the needle and leave a lot hanging over. So what that does is that keeps that out of my way, and I don't have to use such a long pull as I go through what I'm stitching. So I'll pull that down, see how much I have there where these 2 are pulled through. So I don't have a whole lot here, and as I get this used up down here, I'll just pull those back through the needle, and then I'll just keep doing that until I get toward the end. And it just makes it a lot easier, gives you a shorter stroke as you're doing your stitching. So I'll bring you back and we'll put this up in the stitching horse and we'll get started. First thing I'm going to do is open up my stitching horse, and I can come up through the bottom. I want to make sure that my pieces of scrap are actually touching the wood part, and then I got to make sure that my stitches themselves, my stitching holes, are above the horse, because if you clamp this down and they're too far down, you won't be able to get to your stitching holes. So once I get that in there, I want to line this up the best I can. You can do that by taking an extra needle, or one of the needles you're going to use, and putting it through both holes, one on each side, and then straightening that needle up, and that'll tell you if you're even or not. Once you have that, you push your clamp down. Again, I always like to take one of these extra clamps. I've got some short ones and I've got some long ones. I'll take this shorter one here, and I'll put that on my stitching horse and give it a little bit more tension, and you can tell that's in there pretty snug, and that's what I want. I don't want it super tight so that I make impressions on my leather, but I want it snug so it doesn't move around. So I'll take my needle out of my holes that I positioned with, and I'm going to start up here at the top and find my first two holes. And I do have a small pair of needle nose pliers, very small, and if I need to, I can use those to pull my needles through. If you have good clean holes, depending on the size of your punch, you may not need that, but I always keep them handy just in case I do. Then the first thing you want to do is make sure that on that first stitch that your holes line up and that your needles line up. So pull that sinew through, or that thread, line those holes up, and then pull those needles up and make sure that they match at the top, like so. You want to make sure that thread's even on both sides. That way you'll come out even down here at the toe when you get finished. Now, I hope you can see that when I pull that up, that pulls that together. When I let go, it naturally wants to spread apart. So the first thing I need to do is, don't worry if that wants to pull apart. Just make sure that we have our needles even. I'm going to come back, go through the second hole. I'm sorry if my hand's in the way. It makes it a little difficult when you're filming. But I'll go through the second hole from the needle, from the outside through. Take the needle that's on the back side, kind of squeeze that together, and try to make sure you don't split your sinew or your thread. And then pull that needle through to the back side. So you're going through the same hole, two needles, two different directions, and then I'll pull that on both sides and snug that down. And what that does is that holds that together. That locks my stitch in. So now this isn't wanting to pull apart anymore. It's already stuck together. But since this is my first stitch, and that's where it's going to get a lot of wear with the gun going in and out, I'm going to back up, go through my first hole again, from the outside to the inside, or the back side. Pull that tight. Take my second needle and back it through that top hole from the back side to the front side. Now, yeah, I've got 4 pieces of sinew through there now in that first hole, so that's where I may need to take my needle nose and help pull that needle through that hole. Now I've got 2 solid stitches in those first 2 holes, so that's double stitched right there. Snug it back down, that'll lock it in even tighter, makes it twice as strong. Now I can go ahead and go back through that second hole again. And I may need to tighten this down just a little bit more, the stitching horse. And going through the second hole, remember I've already been through that second hole also. So I may need to use my needle nose to pull that needle through. Snug that down, take the needle on the back side, put it through the same hole from the back to the front again. Now we have that totally double stitched in those first 2 holes, and we pull that nice and snug, and we've got a double stitch in those first 2 holes all locked in. This is not going to come apart now. That's twice as strong as any of the rest of this is going to be until we get down to the toe, and I'll show you how we do that. So to continue the saddle stitching, go to the next hole, go front to back, take the needle in the back and go back to front through the same hole. Now take your time. You don't want to split your leather, you don't want to split your thread or your sinew. And then snug it down. Each time lock that stitch in. Now what that's going to do is we travel down through here, it's going to lock each one of those stitches in. So I'm going to continue on down doing the same thing from front to back, back to front through the same hole with my second needle, and then lock it down. So this starts becoming really nice and straight as those holes line up as we move our way down. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up, continue doing the same thing for each hole, front to back, back to front, until I get down here to the toe, and then I'll slow it back down and we'll finish this toe up. So keep an eye on this as I speed it up. Alright, I'm down now to the last 3 holes in the toe, and you can see how my thread is tightened up on my needle. See how long it is now? As I went, I just kept pulling that through as I needed it, and it kept it out of my way as far as the length of the stroke. As I came down, I didn't have to pull the needle through or the thread through so far each time, so it kind of cuts your stitching stroke down. So now I'm down. Remember when we started, we did the length of the stitch times 4, and you can see how far down we are. I know when you first start on that, it's like that's way too much thread when you first get started on that, and you measure it out. It's like, oh, there's no way it's going to take that much thread. Well, you got to remember you're saddle stitching, so you're going through each side twice, and then you're locking those in, so there's a lot of thread that goes in there. And then with both of these pieces of leather together, this is probably 9-10 ounce leather, so approximately 8 to 10. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick. So when you put those together back here on this backbone, that's a good 1/4 inch of leather you're going through. So if you think about that, each time you go through one of those stitches, and there's a ton of them down through here, that's a 1/2 an inch of thread. So when you look at it like that, then it makes a lot more sense. Now I'm going in the last hole on the toe down here, so I'll go through just like I was before. So I'll go outside in, inside out with the other needle, pull that through. I'm getting down close to the end here where I don't have a lot of thread sticking through the eye of my needle. So I'll bend that over, and this is waxed sinew, and what it does is that wax helps keep that obviously from rotting, but it also helps lock that in real good and tight. Now, just like we did at the first when we started with the double stitch, I'll back up, go through that second hole for the second time, and this is where I've already got 2 pieces of thread through that hole, so I may need to use my needle nose to pull that through, and then take my needle on the inside and go from the inside back to the front. Now I've got 3 thicknesses of sinew or thread in there, so I'll take my needle nose, pull that through, and I'll lock that in real good and tight. So that's a double stitch right here on the toe on those last 2. Then this is where it totally locks it in. When you're going to end, take this, you can kind of spread this toe apart by sticking your thumb in there, and I'm just going to go through the front thickness of leather with my front needle, angle it down. See how I have it angled down? And I'm going to push that through to where it comes out in the toe. So it's not going through the second thickness of leather, just the first thickness. Pull that through, and it hangs out the end of the toe here. Now I can take my needle off. The back side needle, my sinew just fell out. I'll rethread that through the eye. And I'll do the same thing on the back side. I'm only going to go through the last hole toward the toe, stick my finger in there, kind of pull that toe apart a little bit, go through the hole on the outside or the inside or the back side, and come out the opening in the toe. I'm not going through both thicknesses of leather. Pull that needle through, that'll pull my thread through, and then I can pull my needle off. And what that does is it leaves both of my threads hanging out the toe. Pull those and lock them tight, and then all I'm going to do is tie a nice tight granny knot. And as you can see, that granny knot disappears up between those two pieces of leather, so nobody can even see your ending tie-off knot because it's hidden up in there. Then I can take a pair of scissors, cut that off, flush, and what that does is it leaves a couple of pieces of that waxed sinew sticking out there. I'll take my stylus and my lighter, and I'll take my stylus and push those threads down in that toe. Now this doesn't take much heat. I'd light it out and move in and then move out, and all I'm doing is smashing that hot melted wax on that thread, that sinew, up in that crease of those stitching where that ends in that toe. And that what that does is that locks my granny knots in, so my knots can't come undone. So that's going to be super strong. I can take my clamp off, take my holster out, and there's my stitching. And I don't know if we can see up in this toe, but you can see where those are actually, that last locking stitch is hidden in there. So from any other position, you're never going to see that. So instead of tying a knot back here or up here, it's up in here. That completes the stitching of the holster for the shoulder rig. Here's the percussion cap pistol that this is for, and as you can see, that slides in there perfectly. Here's your trigger guard. There's your hammer. And that's what it looks like. Fits great. Nice and snug. It's not going to fall out if you just lean over. It's not going to fall out. Maybe we could wet form it a little bit, or you could put a strap on it with a snap. But I'll have to ask the guy I'm doing it for and ask him if he wants a snap or not. But you can see also here off camera, after I dyed it, I also took my thumb while it was still a little moist from dyeing and just rolled this edge over to the outside. And what that does is that puts that little flare on it. You can see it really good in the shadow. Puts that flare on there so that your cylinder doesn't catch it as you're going in and out. So instead of your cylinder coming down on a hard surface and catching that rolled over edge, you can see it really good right there. that rollover edge allows that cylinder to slide right in there. And then you can see that holster expand a little bit as that, see that cylinder go in there? So very happy to this point with this project. Come on back next time. We should be wrapping this up and doing the conclusion on it. And that's where we'll put the shoulder rig and the holster together. We'll put the straps on. That stuff's already pretty much finished anyway, so it won't take very long. It'll be an episode and we'll finish this project up. So thanks a lot for coming along. Hope you learned something today. I know I did. I always do. So please, as I always say, like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.